The Vokath ship came out of the clouds at 0340, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No engine sound, no displacement wave, just the underside of something enormous, sliding through the low overcast like a blade through tissue, and then the landing lights came on and turned the whole valley white. I was already on my feet. 7 years on Fringe Worlds teaches you to sleep light or not at all. And Seth Foy had been making sounds I didn't like for 3 days. Subsonic, holes in the rock, compass drift. We couldn't explain. Animals that had stopped moving through our camp perimeter entirely. The kind of quiet that means something else is listening. I had 7 people with me. Tension Orva on the north slope, Callas at the comm array, Sergeant Mira Dost managing the south entry. 3 more in the equipment shelter who had no business being in a fight and knew it. 2 geological surveyors and a xenobiologist named Pell, who had spent the past week documenting lichen samples and who was currently standing behind me in the dark, holding a sample case to her chest like it would stop a round. "Get inside," I told her. She didn't argue. That's how I knew how bad it looked. The ship settled into a hover at 400 meters. It was wide, low-slung, the hull a dull copper black that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. I counted 6 weapon pods along the ventral line. Not that I needed to count. 1 would have been enough. The scale of it pressed down on us the way pressure presses at depth, a physical thing, the weight of being seen by something that has already decided what you are. Then the transmission came. It arrived on every band simultaneously. It told me their signals team was thorough. It was not in any language I spoke. The translation suite, Callas ran at the comm array, kicked in within 40 seconds. Vokath Reach dialect, standard aggressive register, the kind of language that assumes the listener will be grateful for the clarity. I listened to Callas read it back to me, over the earpiece, her voice flat and careful the way good operators go flat when the news is bad. The Vokath Reach was asserting territorial claim over Seth Forf and all biological assets present on its surface. We were to present ourselves for processing. Failure to comply within 1 standard planetary rotation would result in expedited resolution. I asked Callas what expedited resolution meant. She said the translation suite flagged it as a euphemism for termination. I stood there in the white light and thought about the 7 people behind me and the ship overhead, and the fact that we were 42 light minutes from the nearest relay buoy. I thought about the geological survey, 43 days complete, that Pell had a copy of in that sample case she was gripping. I thought about the Vokath weapon pods, and how long it would take one of them to stop being a threat assessment and become a decision. Then I went to the comm array, and I opened a standard distress relay. This is the part that gets misunderstood when people tell the story later. They assume I opened the relay because I was scared, because I was asking for help, because 8 people alone on a fringe world with a Vokath claim ship overhead had no other move. That's not what a distress relay is, and it's not what I was doing. A distress relay is a beacon. It burns tight beam on 4 military channels simultaneously. It encodes your position, your unit composition, your threat assessment, and your commanding authority, and it transmits outward on a rolling broadcast until someone answers, or until you cancel it. It doesn't ask for help. It reports a contact. It tells the chain of command, we have found something, or something has found us. And here are the coordinates. I hit the relay at 0347. I did not expect an answer inside 48 hours. The 14th Expeditionary Fleet had last reported position at the Doroth Transit Corridor, put them somewhere between 11 and 14 hours out, depending on their current tasking. I thought, if we are lucky, we hold this situation stable for 12 hours, maybe 14. We don't do anything the Vokath can classify as a provocation, and then we see what the fleet makes of a territorial claim on a disputed fringe world. That was my plan. It was a reasonable plan. The relay answered in 6 minutes. Not a confirmation ping, not an automated receipt. Commander Vichol San's voice, direct on a secured channel, saying, "Sergeant Major Oren, we have your position, stand by." 6 minutes. I found out later they had been running transit dark for 9 days. Broadcast signature. On tasking, I still don't have clearance to know. They were 4 hours out when my relay hit. They had been watching C-Force since the Vokath Reach began moving assets toward the contested fringe corridor 3 weeks earlier. Callus had picked up the subsonic rumbles because the Vokath were doing deep geological scans. The animals had stopped moving because the Vokath had seeded the valley with passive sensor nets 48 hours before the ship appeared. The Vokath had been thorough. They had assessed Seth 4 carefully. They had identified 8 human biologicals on the surface, no orbital assets, no military signatures, no support infrastructure. They had looked at us and seen exactly what we appeared to be, a survey team, isolated, undersupplied, and very far from home. They were right about all of that. They had just never asked what the relay buoy was for. The Vokath ship held its hover position for the next 3 hours and 40 minutes. During that time, it transmitted 2 follow-up messages, both in the same aggressive register. Both restating the processing demand with shorter compliance windows. I did not respond to either. Callus logged them, timestamped them, and went back to monitoring the distress relay channel, which had gone quiet after Commander San's 6-word message, but was showing active carrier traffic. Encrypted, dense, the kind of bandwidth that means a lot of people are talking very quickly. At 0731, the carrier traffic stopped. At 0733, the Vokath ship's landing lights went out. At 738, Orva called down from the north slope and said there were new contacts on the atmospheric entry. Multiple. She said it in the flat way. Orva said most things, but I could hear the register underneath it. The tone that meant she had done the count twice before she called, because she didn't trust the first count. I asked her how many. She said she was still counting. I climbed to the north ridge with Mira, and we lay on the rock and looked up, and I understood then what the Vokath had walked into. They came down on through the cloud layer information, not a combat spread, not a threat posture. Just the standard entry configuration of a fleet that has somewhere to be and is not particularly concerned about what it finds when it gets there. The gunships first, low and fast, sweeping the valley floor with targeting arrays that were not targeting anything, just painting the landscape the way you paint a landscape, when you want everything on it to know you can see it. Behind them the midline destroyers, wedge-nosed and dark, their hull plating still shedding the cold of transit in long vapor that the cloud layer turned amber in the early light, and behind them, not descending, just becoming visible through the overcast, the way a mountain becomes visible when the weather lifts. The dreadnoughts, 3 of them, holding at high altitude, not needing to come any closer. The Vokath ship did not move for a long time. I watched its hull, I watched the weapon pods. I had spent the last 4 hours imagining a lot of different ways this could go, and most of them involved those pods making a decision, and I had made my peace with that the way you make peace with things you cannot change. But the pods stayed cold. The ship stayed in its hover, and then very slowly, it began to rise. It rose through 200 meters, then 400. Then it hit the cloud base and kept going, and the clouds closed behind it, and that was the last we saw of it. The fleet did not pursue. They held their positions for 40 minutes, sweeping the area, logging the sensor nets the Vokath had seeded in the valley. Callus said later they cataloged 63 of them, which was thorough work. The Vokath were genuinely thorough. And then the gunships pulled up first, then the destroyers, and the dreadnoughts faded back into the overcast the way they'd appeared, like something that had briefly considered this valley and decided it was handled. Commander San's voice came back on the relay at 0841. She said, "Sergeant Major, you are clear. Good work." I didn't feel like I had done good work. I had opened a relay and stayed out of the way. But I understood what she meant. People ask me sometimes what that morning taught me about the Vokath. I tell them it didn't teach me much about the Vokath. It taught me something about us. The Vokath were competent. They had done everything right by their own doctrine, identified isolated biologicals on a contested world, assessed the threat level, transmitted a lawful claim, allowed a compliance window. They were not reckless. They were not stupid. They looked at Seth IV and they saw what was there. They just didn't know what a relay buoy was for. And that's the thing I keep coming back to. All these years later, when someone asks me to explain what first contact with the Vokath Reach was like, what it felt like, what it meant, because the Vokath had made a perfectly reasonable calculation. 8 humans on a fringe world, no ship, no military infrastructure, 42 light minutes from the nearest navigation marker. In their threat model, that was a rounding error. That was 8 soft targets on a rock they wanted, and the only question was how long the processing would take. They never considered that we leave people out there because we can get to them, that we know where every team is, that the relay network covers the fringe corridor continuously, that when a survey team goes quiet or lights up a beacon, someone is already moving before the message finishes encoding, that the distance between a human alone on a rock and a human alone on a rock with a fleet 4 hours out is not a tactical distinction the Vokath threat model had a category for. The 14th Expeditionary wasn't there, because we sent them. They were already on their way. We had seen the Vokath assets moving 3 weeks earlier. We had positioned accordingly. 8 people on Seth IV were never alone. We just hadn't needed to mention it. Vokath withdrew their claim from the entire fringe corridor inside 72 hours. No negotiation. No treaty sessions. They just updated their territorial maps, and they stopped transmitting on Vokath Reach frequencies in that sector entirely. I think about that sometimes. The silence of a species recalibrating. They hadn't lost to the fleet. They had already lost the moment they looked at 8 people on a rock and decided that was all they were looking at. First contact with humanity, and they had misread the most basic thing about us, that we do not send anyone anywhere they cannot be reached. The Vokath were thorough. They just weren't thorough enough.